So our first presenters are a mother and her daughter, or a daughter and her mother. Dr. Gail Feldman is a clinical psychologist, a coach, and a former faculty member at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. And Megan presents nationally on healing through creativity and insight. She has spoken in school districts, healthcare systems, and is an award-winning author of Triumph of the Heart. They will be speaking together today on forgiveness and resilience in challenging times. Won't you please welcome Dr. Gail Feldman and her daughter, Megan Feldman Bettencourt.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning. Thank you, all of you, for being here so bright and early. At least it's bright and early for me. I don't know about you. So I'm speaking about forgiveness. And I'm going to start by saying that forgiveness is something that I never thought I would be speaking about. I certainly never thought I would write a book about it. Forgiveness seemed to me to be pretty, maybe wimpy is the word, maybe woo-woo is another word, religiously dogmatic might be another way that I saw forgiveness. So I spent the first 15 years of my career as a full-time journalist. So I was writing about pretty gritty topics. I was covering poverty, I covered wars, genocide, addiction, recovery, and I hadn't really given too much thought to the topic of forgiveness until I went through a pretty difficult time in my own life. So, as I mentioned, I'd been a journalist for many years, and that industry was really starting to crumble as the business model began to fold, and that was really difficult. I had also gone through a really tough breakup, and I was frankly just feeling really bitter and pissed off. So during that time, I had the opportunity to do a national magazine story about a man named Azim Khamisa. This is Azim. He is originally from Kenya, and he moved to the United States as a young man and became an investment banker. So one day, he had just returned from a business trip to Mexico. He was having some tea in the morning in his kitchen in La Jolla, and he got a phone call. And the call was from a police investigator who told Azim that his only child, his only son, Tariq Khamisa, had been shot and killed while delivering a pizza for his job the night before. Now, Azim was clear that this was obviously a mistake. You know, his son Tariq was a very conscientious college student. He'd always been a good kid. He wasn't involved in gangs. So Azim said, this is obviously a mistake. You have the wrong person. He hung up, and then he dialed Tariq's fiance. Her name was Jennifer. And when she answered her phone, she was crying so hard that she couldn't speak. And in that moment, Azim knew that his worst fear, every parent's worst fear, had come true, and his only son was gone. He passed out cold and bumped his head, the back of his head, on the stove that was behind him in his kitchen. When he came to, there was this phrase that rang in his mind, and that phrase was, "There were victims on both ends of the gun." There were victims on both ends of the gun. Now, at that point, Azim didn't know who had shot Tariq, but he resolved that he was going to forgive whoever that person was, and he believed that the words, "there were victims on both ends of the gun," came from God. So he eventually reached out to Tony, who was the young man who killed Tariq, and he forgave him. Now, Tony was a 14-year-old, and he ended up becoming the first juvenile to be prosecuted as an adult in the state of California. And it was part of a gang initiation, this shooting. Tariq was delivering a pizza, and a group of kids tried to rob him. He tried to drive away, and Tony shot him. So Azim reached out to Tony, started to get to know him as he was in prison, and he also reached out to Tony's legal guardian and grandfather, who's a man named Ples Felix. And together, Azim and Ples, first of all, they became extremely close friends. And secondly, they started a nonprofit that does youth education and specifically nonviolence education in public middle schools. So to date, they've reached more than 9 million kids around not just the country, but the world. And today, Tony, who you can see in this picture, so you see Tariq is in Azim's picture, and then Tony is in Pless's frame there. So Tony, who was 14 when he killed Tariq, has now been released from prison. He's a grown man, almost in middle age, and he works with Azim and Ples. So Azim and Ples and Tony take the stage at these school assembly events, and they share their story of how one man lost his grandson to prison, one man lost his son to a shooting, and Tony, of course, shares his story about his own journey of redemption, really. So, when I spent time with Azim and Ples, I was really struck by the way Azim talked about how he only survived losing his son because of forgiveness. He would talk about how he really was clear that if he hadn't have forgiven, he would not have been able to survive, and he would not have been able to create a meaningful life. And as I mentioned, I wasn't really down with forgiveness at this point, right? But I was curious. I was really curious because of the power of their story. And so I wondered, and as part of this national magazine story, I was getting to explore and do research. I wondered, okay, so what is, if Azim says that forgiveness is what saved his life after losing his son, is there proof, that shows that this is really healthy for us? Is there proof that really shows that if we want to be mentally healthy, if we want to be physiologically healthy, we have to forgive? And I came upon two bodies of research. The first body of research, very well established, long established, and that is the research about the impact of anger and resentment on our brains and bodies over time. So, we know that multiple studies show that when we get really angry, it throws us into fight or flight. And what that means is our brains are pretty much bathed in stress chemicals like cortisol and norepinephrine. And if we stay in that reaction over a period of time, we're then at risk to develop high blood pressure, which can lead to heart issues. We also inhibit our frontal lobe of the brain's ability to solve problems. And we put ourselves at risk for mental health issues and symptoms like depression and anxiety. Now, the second body of research I came across during the course of this magazine piece is the research about forgiveness specifically, right? So what is the impact of forgiveness processes on mental health and physiological health? This is a newer body of research starting in the mid to late 90s. And multiple studies show that forgiveness can reverse the impacts of long-standing anger and resentment. So what does that mean? That means that people who have gone through a series of forgiveness practices in studies, they show that these people in some cases have increased the blood flow to their hearts. When studies were looking at cardiac patients, Other studies show that people who went through a series of forgiveness practices were actually able to jump higher than their peers who didn't, which I think, in addition to being funny, it really actually is borne out and makes sense, and I'll get to that in a minute. And then anecdotally, in a clinical setting, I studied a burn surgeon who said that he noticed that his patients, his severely burned patients, who were able to let go of their resentment actually healed faster than those who didn't. So this wasn't great news for me. So, I mentioned at the beginning that I thought forgiveness was either woo-woo or religiously dogmatic or for wimps, maybe for preachers. It wasn't for me. And the idea that we have to be able to forgive and be forgiving to be mentally healthy and physiologically healthy was not great news. I wasn't super happy about that. I was born more of a pessimist, and research shows that people who are more pessimistic by nature tend to hold grudges, which makes sense if you think about it. While people who are more optimistic naturally tend to be able to forgive more easily. So, it was kind of like, I liked holding grudges. It was kind of like eating a Snickers bar, It felt good. It felt good to be so right about how wrong certain people were. I enjoyed it. But apparently it wasn't good for me. So then I wondered, okay, if this really is critical, how does this play out in different situations and different places for different people in both the interpersonal and the collective arenas? So that question really turned into a quest, which became my book, Triumph of the Heart: Forgiveness in an Unforgiving World. So I was privileged to be able to travel to 9 different states and to Africa and spend really a couple of years, thanks to Penguin, my publisher, exploring this question in a lot of different places. So I explored everything from, what is the role of forgiveness in intimate relationships? How do people forgive abusive parents? What is the role of apology and amends in forgiveness? I got to explore in the more collective arena how forgiveness practices actually reduce suspensions by more than 200% in a Baltimore school. And I got to spend time with survivors of genocide in Rwanda, as well as perpetrators of the genocide, to talk with them and hear their stories of seeking and granting forgiveness after the genocide. Now, when the book came out and I was starting to do readings, I was starting to do talks about it, I realized that the people like Azim, who forgave very extreme trespasses, they tended to share 3 really important things. So that's what I want to share with you about specifically today. And I like to call them the 3 key habits of good forgivers. They're really 3 different areas that include a lot of different habits and practices. But I like using these 3 areas as umbrella terms. So the first area that these people who have forgiven really large things tend to share is something that I call authenticity. So what do I mean when I say authenticity? The first thing is they allowed themselves to feel how they felt when they felt that way. Isn't that radical? So many of us, I think, even in the mental health field, can get into the habit of just operating on top of anything that's going on because we don't have the time or the energy. We've got to be the parent. We've got to be the grandparent. We've got to get the job done. There's so much busyness, right? And so it's easy to just stuff our feelings. But people like Azim and others in my book, they really couldn't do that because on some level they knew that it literally would be impossible to continue if they just pretended and try to go about the motions of life. So, for example, Azim, after he lost Tariq, he went through a period of depression, of course. He was even suicidal at one point. And instead of just trying to keep going with his investment banking career and everything else he had going on, he stopped. He spent about a week at a friend's cabin in the mountains and just let himself be absolutely devastated and let himself process those feelings. He became enraged. So this is a man who left his native Kenya to avoid violence and lost his only son to American street violence. He was enraged, doesn't even cover it, right? But he let himself be angry. He let himself feel it. He let himself process it. And because he did that, he was able to move through those different stages instead of getting stuck. And most importantly, he was able to channel his anger in a productive way and respond instead of react. So I think that's really instructive for all of us. Whether we have lost someone who's near and dear to us or gone through a particularly traumatic event, or whether we're just dealing with the regular day-to-day in our very chaotic world, we can allow ourselves to feel our feelings and really make time and space for that. It's really, really important. And the other thing, and this won't come as a surprise to all of you in this room because of who you are, but the other piece of it is mindfulness, is noticing and labeling our thoughts and feelings so that we're not constantly getting sucked into them, right? Because the moment we notice our thoughts and feelings, we're creating the space to process, but also we're creating a little bit of distance as opposed to really getting just, taken away by them. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say about that with respect to people who've gone through severe trauma is just another quick example. There was a woman who I had the great honor and privilege of spending time with on my reporting trip to Rwanda. Her name is Chantal, and she had lost her entire family during the genocide in 1994. And when I sat with her, we spent some days together in Kigali, and when I sat with her and the topic of forgiveness came up, she said, it took me 15 years to even think about forgiveness. 15 years. She lost her whole family. Right? So it's difficult to describe the amount of grief that would entail, right? So again, just to summarize, whether we've gone through really big things or we're just dealing with day-to-day life, authenticity, which is grief, and letting ourselves feel our feelings, and also mindfulness, critical. And that's Azim and Pless speaking together, speaking of processing feelings and creating something extraordinary. Okay, so the second area that these good forgivers, quote unquote, tend to share is boundaries. Now, what do I mean when I say boundaries in the context of forgiveness? Well, it's probably not surprising to hear this, but in our culture, and maybe in many cultures, the concept of forgiveness has really been lumped in with a lot of other things. It's been lumped in with reconciliation. It's been confused with foregoing justice, foregoing accountability. It's often been used as a cudgel by abusers, particularly in highly patriarchal religious communities, to re-abuse victims and keep victims silent, right? Because if you have to forgive to go to heaven, and that means you can't report the person who assaulted you. So this is extremely dangerous and extremely toxic, and that's why I think really being very clear about what is forgiveness, what does it mean to forgive, is so critical. So the definition of the word forgive is to release resentment. That's it, to release resentment, right? So You can do that while inviting someone over for Thanksgiving dinner, or you can do that and not speak to them again, right? You can release resentment and demand accountability, file a lawsuit, right? So there's two women who I interviewed for my chapter on forgiving parents. Both women had been abused by their fathers, and the first woman chose to forgive her father, and she went through this, process, right? It's always a process. It's not like a one-time thing, like, oh, we've forgiven and it's done. It really is an ongoing practice. And so she did a lot of work. She did a lot of exercises, a lot of practices, and by the way, as I went about reporting the book, I collected a lot of these practices and habits, and I slapped them into my appendix, and I still hold on to them, and I use them in my corporate wellness programs, and I use them in my one-on-one coaching practice, and I've used them a lot in my own life, and it has made a huge, huge difference. I don't think I would be married without these forgiveness practices. I don't think I would be much of a good parent. If I did have my kids, I have two, I think I would probably yell a lot more. So I just wanted to share that. And so the woman who I mentioned who forgave her father, she had gone through a number of these forgiveness practices. And she talked about how after she did that, she started to remember things about her father, like from her childhood that she had never remembered. Like she had these great memories of going to get ice cream and sitting on the back of her father's bike out for a ride. She said that it was almost like getting a new childhood. And every time she would talk to her dad, he would usually be drunk. He would usually end up calling her names. And it wasn't contributing to her life. And so for her, it really worked to, forgive her dad, move forward with the positive memories she had of this new childhood that she got, while not having contact with him. The second woman I spent time with who had forgiven her father for abuse, and actually it was incest when she was a child, she forgave her dad, and she also ended up nursing him on his deathbed when he was dying of cancer. It was really cathartic for her. It was healing. So we can see how there's a freedom in this, to choose what path works for each person, right? There's no prescription. There's no, you have to reconcile and have someone over for dinner. No, there is choice. So the Jewish philosopher Maimonides talked about levels of forgiveness. And I like that. I also think, though, that the idea of a spectrum is really nice because levels kind of implies that there's a better way or a lesser way. And a spectrum just gives a lot of freedom, right? So I want to share a story from my reporting trip to Rwanda about the possibility of forgiveness, or what's possible when you forgive on one end of that forgiveness spectrum, okay? This is Father Ubald, and I met Father Ubald when I traveled with my translator to a rural part of Rwanda that's close to the border with Congo. Now, my translator was a genocide survivor herself. She had lost I think 20 members of her family in the violence in 1994. And so it was great to have her with me because when people were speaking Kinyarwanda, which I don't speak, or Kinyarwandan, sorry, not only did she translate, but as a survivor of the violence herself, she could really gut check, what was being said. So Father Ubald came to pick us up at the bus station because we were staying with him at this Catholic parish where he ran a program that he had started for survivors and perpetrators of the genocide. Now, when I talk about a forgiveness program, it wasn't just survivors and perpetrators learning about the seeking and granting of forgiveness. It was survivors of the genocide and the perpetrators who had murdered their family members, coming together and doing very deep work over a period of at least 6 months. So the group would meet twice a week, every week, ongoingly for at least 6 months. And part of that process was redemption and amends. And so what that looked like was, this is a very rural area, okay? So perpetrators could give the family that they had victimized a goat or a cow. If they didn't have anything to give other than an authentic apology, they would volunteer their time and labor to work the family's land for a period of time, just as an example. So I knew that I really wanted to spend time with this program, and that meant staying at Father Ubald's parish, interviewing participants in the program, interviewing him. I didn't know anything about him, really, aside of the fact that he ran this program. And so he picks us up from the bus stop, and he's in his white, long robe. We get in the car, and he says, "Oh, I hope you don't mind, but my daughter is coming over for dinner tonight." And he must have noticed my face, because I looked very confused, I think. Because here's this Catholic priest talking about his daughter. And so it turns out that what happened is his parishioners smuggled him across the border to the Congo during the genocide, and that's how he survived. He came back a couple of years later and started preaching about forgiveness in the prisons, and the prisons at that point were filled with genocide convicts. So one day he's preaching about redemption and seeking forgiveness, and afterwards this man comes up to him and says, "Father, I've been working up the courage to come talk with you. I'm the man who murdered your mother." And Father Ubald said it was almost like he got hit by a Mack truck. That's what it felt like. And he stood there, and he was committed to walking his talk, and he developed a relationship with this man. He would come visit him in prison, and they would talk. And he learned that the man's children had been orphaned because his wife had died of a disease, and of course he was in prison. So Father Ubald adopted the children of the man who murdered his mother. Okay, he adopted the children of the man who killed his mom. And I actually got to meet his daughter Giselle that evening because she did come by for dinner on her way to medical school in Burundi. So just an example of what's possible, right, when we commit to forgiveness. Okay, so the third area that these people who have forgiven very big things tend to share is that they're spiritual. Now, when I say spiritual, I don't mean religious in the sense of worshiping an external God. I'm talking about the Latin root of the word spirit, which means courage, breath, and vigor. So it takes massive courage to forgive, obviously. People would talk about how it was like a weight being lifted from their chest. Like after they did forgiveness work, they felt like they could actually breathe again. They also talked about having a lot more energy. So courage, breath, and vigor. And then the other thing I mean when I talk about being spiritual is being guided by a larger purpose. So most of you here in this room are probably very familiar with Viktor Frankl, I am assuming. Anyone? Viktor Frankl? Yes? Yeah, okay, so Austrian psychiatrist, survivor of Auschwitz. After he survived the Holocaust, he went on to write more than 30 books. The most famous is Man's Search for Meaning. And he also created a kind of therapy, which he called logotherapy. And one of the core tenets of that was supporting people in creating meaning and creating purpose in their lives. And he talked about how living guided by meaning and purpose was critical to creating a life worth living after extreme trauma like the kind that he had survived. So this is why Azim talks about how forgiveness isn't actually about the past. Forgiveness is about the future. It's about the future we're creating right now. So in that spirit, I want to extend an invitation to all of you here. And I mentioned that in my appendix of Triumph of the Heart, I've got a lot of very specific forgiveness exercises and practices, right? These are two, or I guess three. One is to write a letter to yourself, forgiving yourself for something. We tend to be much harder on ourselves than on other people. We hold ourselves to higher standards, unless we happen to be narcissistic. But most of us hold ourselves to higher standards than others. So forgiving ourselves is more difficult. Okay, so write a letter to yourself, forgiving yourself for something. The second one is write a letter to someone else, forgiving them for something. You don't have to send it. And then the third is to reflect on what is the larger purpose, what is the larger meaning that's really inspiring your life right now. And maybe you've been clear about that in the past, but maybe it's time to refresh. I find it helpful to refresh regularly so that I'm really present to the larger purpose that's guiding me. And for me, just being here and be able to share these stories is hugely purposeful and meaningful. So I thank you for that. And I want to read briefly this quote from the late, great Maya Angelou, because it's about the difference between resentment and bitterness and righteous anger. And I think it's relevant to the times we're living through now. She said, "You should be angry. You must not be bitter. Bitterness is like cancer. It eats upon the host. It doesn't do anything to the object of its displeasure. So use that anger. You write it, you paint it, you dance it, you march it, you vote it, you do everything about it. You talk it. Never stop talking it." So I'm going to turn it over to my mom, Dr. Gail Feldman, and she's going to share with us some stories about the broader category of resilience.
Well done, well done. Welcome, everyone. Megan just shared powerful stories about how the courage to forgive can lead to meaning and life purpose. I'm going to tell you now about one man's journey through trauma that led to amazing expressions of personal creativity. In January of 1968, Michael Naranjo was with the 9th Infantry in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. "We were in a rice field," he said, "when the Viet Cong opened fire. 7 of us were shot immediately, 1 our medic. I was on my belly reaching for a grenade when a grenade rolled into my right hand and exploded." The last thing Michael remembered was a medic giving him a shot and saying, "You're going out now." And he lost consciousness for 2 days. When he woke in a hospital in Japan, he realized he was completely blind. "We were in a large space like a gymnasium," he said, "and on my right was a man who had lost his ears and was deaf. On the other side of me was a man who was just babbling. He was brain injured and had lost his mind. I had my mind and I had one good hand, so I was in great shape. I came to appreciate what I did have rather than what I didn't have." And here Michael displays the primary quality that distinguishes the resilient from those who don't fare quite as well, and that is optimism. The capacity for positive thinking that allows for hope and causative action in the most difficult circumstances. At the Veterans Hospital for the Blind in Palo Alto, California, he was informed that his intention to become a sculptor again was completely unrealistic. But the first thing he asked for was a ball of clay, and he started forming figures with his left hand. He then refused to make wallets, and when he was finally allowed to go to a woodworking class, he refused to make a bench. Instead, he found a small piece of smooth wood, and he began to carve a bear. My mother was a potter, and I grew up alongside her fashioning clay when we were first at Santa Clara and then at the Taos Pueblo, where we moved when I was 9. Well, most of Michael's 9 brothers and sisters went to college and became professionals. After attending the Institute of American Indian Affairs in Santa Fe, Michael's passion was drawing, design, and sculpture. Michael knew the way to his passion, and he insisted on finding it. Disability is destroyed by doing something you love, something you're excited about, he said. Of course it's a challenge. Life is a challenge, a game. If you accept it, though, it's a gift, and the dreams you have can come true. Michael had a dream. He told me, I often have colorful, vivid dreams. I had a dream that I could see and touch Michelangelo's sculptures. Not too long after that, Michael was invited to Rome, where he had an audience with the Pope. Following the papal audience, he was taken to a chapel and allowed to examine the Moses. I crawled all over him for half an hour. And for days after, I would have flashes of feeling the softness of that flesh. 2 years later, he went back to Italy and was allowed to see the David. On top of scaffolding, I felt the beauty of the eyes, the tear ducts hiding in the corners, the pupils like hearts. I cried. My dream had come true. I felt the lips so soft, you could feel the heart beating and pumping blood to them. The veins in his neck, the tension of the hands. It was amazing to feel the flesh and the feelings of a man 18 feet tall. Afterward, I had new life in my hands. I could see twice as much. Michael's exhibitions and awards and honors are vast. His sculptures found in many collections in the Vatican, Washington, D.C., and this one in my living room. Also, his contribution to teaching and volunteering in Santa Fe is impressive. My blindness is a gift, he insists. It has given me a new way of looking at life. Resilience in psychology is defined as the positive capacity to cope well with stress and even catastrophe. And it includes the ability to come back to homeostasis after a crisis. Now, animals do this naturally. They literally shake off trauma. I've seen videos of the ibex in Africa after getting injured or they're down. They stand up, they run a distance, stand still, and shake like mad. And then the polar bears in Alaska, the biologists come in on a helicopter, they shoot the bear with a stun gun, they run over, they tag it, do it, hop back on the helicopter, and as they're pulling away, you can see the bear comes to, stands up, runs a distance, stops, and shakes like mad, and back to normal. Would that it be so easy for humans? We need more help to process trauma, as we can easily get stuck in some stage of the grief. Now, Michael did not bypass his grief like I may have suggested. He had times of depression, he had crying jags, he had fits of anger, but he didn't linger there. And I want to review the stages of grief, recognizing, of course, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who began with her 5 stages. And I had the great honor of knowing her, of talking with her about the more difficult aspects of grieving through trauma. She had been working with terminal cancer patients, and so it was based on these experiences that she did her stages. And I expanded on these. So the first stage is what I call the 3 Ds: denial, disbelief, dissociation. And all of you who have experienced or treated people with serious trauma know that dissociation is clearly one of the aspects. The second stage, anger, not just anger, but outrage. The third stage, obsession and rumination. Now, this was the stage that Kubler-Ross had called bargaining, and that's because the cancer patients she worked with, she noticed that they would be trying to bargain with God, if you'll just let me live to see my daughter married or some other event. But again, with trauma, it's much more complicated. Years ago, I worked with the Resource Center for Victims of Violent Death. And basically, these were parents who had children who were murdered. So this stage of obsession and rumination was a stage for many of them that would have them just feel like they were going insane because it would last so long. They would go over and over and over. If only I hadn't let her go out that night. If only I had done this. If only this had happened instead, and so on. In the biblical story of Job, 13 times he says, well, if only, if only. And the last time, Job had lost his whole family, lost everything. The last time he says, if only God would take this rod from my back. So, the next stage, not just depression, but despair and illness, actually. With some of the parents I treated, I think the guilt becomes so intense that they're still alive and their child is not, that they feel that they should break down, they should get ill, they should die. So it's a very, very complicated, long-term type of grieving. And then forgiveness. As so many, Megan and so many writers and clinicians have taught us about the importance of forgiveness. And then acceptance, completion with the past. And the ability to start to create a new life, a new chapter. Now, over the years, many different modes of therapy have been developed to help us process grief. And Peter Levine and his somatic experiencing therapy, you've heard about it, is informed by these discoveries of how animals shake off trauma and how humans need help with this process. And these are 4 of the areas that he talks about and that are used in many of these modes of therapy. Accessing and exploring the physical sensations. Desensitization, gradually approaching and processing the traumatic material. Pendulation, moving back and forth between the distressing sensations and comfortable states. Grounding and resourcing, connecting with positive experiences, connecting with the person's internal strengths. So all of these aspects are used in the following treatment methods: cognitive behavioral therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, hypnosis, including regression hypnosis, which I've used successfully over many years in treating trauma, somatic experiencing. And I want to say a little bit more about positive psychology. Martin Seligman, I used to be able to refer to him as the father of positive psychology, but that was 30 years ago, so now I have to call him the grandfather of positive psychology. But he really helped us to pay attention to learned optimism, because all clinicians were familiar with learned helplessness and that concept that leads to depression. But the learned optimism is a reminder that we can use cognitive restructuring and other positive thinking strategies to help rebuild resilience. And all of these treatment methods provide a sense of safety and moving toward resilience and the ability to forgive. And we could also add here the global group programs that Megan learned about that are designed to help groups of people recover from trauma. Research shows that that there are 4 main qualities. Actually, there are many more, and Deborah mentioned those yesterday. But I want to highlight these 4. Optimism, empathy, emotion regulation, and self-efficacy. And I love this one because self-efficacy is it's a special kind of confidence that resilient people have that others don't, where they will look at a situation that 90% of people would say, well, there's nothing to be done about it. There's nothing we can do, we can't change that. And the resilient people have that conviction that they can influence situations for good, and they move forward. And I want to share an important fact, the 40% factor. Now, this applies to adults. So in adults, only 10% of what makes us depressed, anxious, or upset comes from the outside event. 50% is genetic predisposition. And that leaves 40% that's up to us. We get to choose how to respond and not react. So I'd like to tell you now about how art was used to help one little boy process trauma. Some years ago, I worked in a child psychiatry clinic, and we had a contract with the Indian Health Service. So one morning, I came into the waiting room, and there was this native woman dressed in beautiful, the long skirt, the velveteen blouse, the concho belt, and so on. And her little boy, Joey, 7 years old, was sitting next to her, all hunched over, looking at the floor. And I'd read in the intake form that Joey's father had died in a tractor accident the year before, and Joey had not spoken a word since then, and he wouldn't engage in school. So I asked Joey to come back to the playroom with me, and I just put white paper in front of him and crayons. And I said, I understand you live on a farm. Would you make a picture of your favorite animal? So he drew a dog, and I said, I'll bet you have other animals you like too. Would you draw them? So he drew a cow, and then he drew a horse. And I said, I understand your father died last year, and you must miss him very much. Would you make a picture of him? So he drew a picture, stick figure, cowboy hat. And I said, do you know how your father died? He nodded yes. I said, please make a picture of that for me. So he set about drawing this big tractor and a little man on the ground. And as he drew, tears started rolling down his cheeks, and before long, little sobs were shaking his whole body. When he finished, I offered him tissues. I said, do you want to take your picture home? No. So he and his mother left, and I never saw him again. But 2 weeks later, I called his mother, and she said, I don't know what you did to him, but he's talking again. and he's enjoying school, and he's making clay animals. His father always brought him clay from the river, and he made clay animals. We called him the Adobe Kid. So the Adobe Kid was back. I did nothing but invite him to make a picture of the trauma. I've had no training as an art therapist, but we can all at times use the power of artistic expression to process grieving feelings. And where is forgiveness in this example? Well, Joey didn't need to forgive because he processed the trauma at the time, unlike so many adults I've treated who grew up having lost a parent or a grandparent when they were small, and because of magical thinking, internalized this guilt that they were responsible. So one example is a man in his late 50s who came for therapy because he was anxious and depressed, had been his whole life, very unhappy. In hypnosis, he went to a time when he was 5 years old. His father was leaving for work. He felt like his father left for work all the time. He was always away. So on this particular morning, his father was off to the airport, and this angry little boy said to him, "I hope your plane crashes." And it did. And the father died. So it took this man 50 years to realize, because so many of those memories are repressed, to realize it was time to forgive himself, and it was time to create the life that his father would have wanted him to live. This is Michael in his studio. I love this picture of him being contemplative. You know, here's a man who uses power tools and he's blind. I said, "How do you do this?" "Oh, I rarely hurt myself. And in fact, I forget that I'm blind until I run into something." This is one of his large sculptures, Eagle Man. And I want to leave you with these words. If I try, if I work at it, I'll win. My job is to find the way around obstacles. There are no problems, just challenges. You find a purpose and you go forth. So online, there's a handout, Foundations for Resilience, and I'll just share with you the first part, and it's based on SOAP, S-O-A-P, so remember your SOAP. S stands for spirituality and social connection. O for optimism and self-efficacy. A, appreciation and gratefulness, and P, purpose and commitment to service. And then there are 14 other practices that you can look for. Thank you so much.
Hi. Thank you, Megan and Gail. My name is Herb Landis. I practice in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'm a therapist there. In the early 1990s, I remember just getting out of grad school and having read the first article in the family, it wasn't the psychotherapy networker, but it was the family therapy networker on forgiveness. And I just remember how shocked I was that somebody would actually write in a professional magazine about forgiveness, because it did seem like that topic that you just didn't talk about, or it was like really rooted in religion. In my community back in 2006, there was an Amish, the Nickel Mines Amish shooting. I don't know if you're aware of that, but this man came into a one-room schoolhouse and killed 5 girls.
Yeah.
And I was involved in some of the critical incident stress debriefing afterwards. And it's interesting, the families were quick to forgive. And the day after, these families went to the family of the shooter to sit and to say we forgive. Now that's hard. Like at the time, my kids were young. I'm not sure if I could have done that, but I think this intention, as you had talked about, like this willingness to forgive and let go, is just so releasing of all this other negative energy that you would use. And one last thing, the children, they drew pictures and they processed their feelings, some of which was anger, but mostly it was graciousness. These pictures they drew, they wanted me to give them to my kids. They knew I had kids. But they were pictures of like helicopters and ambulances and things like that. Anyway, it left a pretty strong impact on me in working with forgiveness. These stories are just wonderful that you shared. One question, this resentment and grudges that people have, do you know, is it possible that sometimes we hold on to that because there's actually a kind of a dopamine increase that we would experience? So that's one question I have, because some people can just hold on and hold on. Anyway, I'll let
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I will address that, and then I will have you chime in. So, yes, first of all, it's comfortable, because I think I think both of us spoke a little bit to optimism and pessimism, and how part of that is our genes, and I joked about how I'm more of a born grudge holder than, and pessimist and catastrophist than optimist. But yes, so I think especially for those of us who are more on the natural pessimism spectrum, it feels better than despair to be really angry and blame someone and know how right you are and how wrong they are. It feels more empowering than depression and despair, which, of course, in the extreme can lead to suicidal ideation. So the other thing is that once we get into that habit, like anything else, right, it truly is a habit. So it's like a dog with a bone, with the blame and the being self-righteous and not wanting to let it go. And to let it go then becomes very much the unknown. And that's scary.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is a universal, but what I found in situations with extreme trauma is that men tend to get stuck in the anger stage much more. Again, maybe it's the testosterone, I don't know, but and women tend to get stuck in a depression, despair, and giving up kind of a place. Yeah.
I want to thank you. It was so nice, the cadence of your performance, being able to follow the slides. It was thank you, first one in the morning. I learned a lot, and I really appreciated being able to take it in a rhythmic sort of format instead of feeling like I'm missing so much. I really appreciated so much. I, like you, had the good fortune of knowing Kubler-Ross, and it's wonderful that you've been able to apply her work into trauma. This has been an exceptional presentation for me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so
Thank
much,
you so
Georgiana. It's great to see you. Thank you.
We have time for one more comment.
Good morning. I just want to reiterate what she said, but I wanted to ask if you could expand upon the self-efficacy point. Thanks.
I wish I could. I don't have any great examples. Maybe some years ago I did, but I just remember that piece sticking with me. And again, it has to do with the fact that resilient people really do have a genetic predisposition to be strong and healthy. I mean, one piece of research years ago, it was a longitudinal study of at-risk children, seriously at risk, parents, abandoned parents in prison or drugs and all that. And over time, what they found was that 70% of these children dropped by the wayside into suicide. And I found that when I was interviewing cult survivors after my first book. I would ask the women, do you have siblings? And they'd say, well, I used to have a brother, but he committed suicide. Suicide, the prison system, something. Only 30% became resilient human beings, very successful and able to have wonderful relationships and be pillars of the community, 30%. So this is powerful, and I think there's something in that population that enables them to look at situations, and again, where other people say, well, it's always been like this, or you can't, he's impossible to deal with. They'll move forward and do it, so.
I have a quick thing on self-efficacy that's from my own life, which is that my son, who's 10 years old, has ADHD, so both the focus deficits and the hyperactive components. And he's in a great school that has provided amazing accommodations, and he's also in the gifted program. And one of the things that they do every single school year is the gifted instructor suggests specific goals for that semester and for that school year. And one of the goals that she suggested last year was actually building his metric for self-efficacy. And what that meant in this context is self-efficacy, in part, it's confidence, but it's not just self-belief based on self-belief. It's actually, for him, it means creating success, like giving him the scaffolding to succeed in school, whether that's doing well on a test, reading a book and writing an essay, whatever that is. But with every assignment or activity that he can do successfully, that builds his confidence and his self-efficacy in terms of his own, because he's actively building his confidence, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you
Megan
so
and
much.
Gail, that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.